So in this video we're going to discuss how to solve this, finding marks for a specific student if we give a student ID. We can carry on where we left off, so we'll do some experimentation and then we'll put our solution into a function or possibly a couple of functions. So we've got our data, we know what it looks like when we print it out. It's a list of a list. If we want to find the third student's ID, we have to do something like we have to say, okay, let's get hold of the third row, and then the student ID is going to be in 0. So that gives us, that's how we have to access the information in a two-dimensional array. So we're going to simply loop through this list, one list at a time actually. So this is a list of a list, so we're going to go through each student ID and we're just going to check whether the student ID is equal to a particular student ID that we want, and then we'll just print that out. So let's just do a very specific solution which just searches for student MH1 to begin with. So again, this is going to be a for loop. So we've already got our data, so we can say something like for stu in data. So this is the name of a variable that is a temporary variable used in the for loop, which is going to store one student at a time. That's why I've called it student. So each iteration through the loop will store a new student in here. So we're going to go through and get hold of a student. So then we can say if, again I'm going to make use of this information here. So I'm going to say if student 0, because this is going to be one line, if that's equal to MH1, then what I'd like to happen is, let's just do a very simple, let's just print out all of the information to do with that particular line, and we can worry about the formatting later. So that's what we're going to do. This is a very specific loop, and what I'm expecting is MH1's information appears here. So let's run this code. Actually only MH1 appears because I've actually referenced just the very first element of the list, and what I actually want is all of it in one go. So let's run this now, and here I have MH1's information. So we're now going to make this into a function so that it can find any student if we give it a student ID. So for that we're going to turn this into a function. So let's just move this down here, because we're going to make this into a function, and all this function is going to do is it's going to get student, and it's going to get hold of a student based on some ID that I give it. So let's just make this into a function. Just tab that in. Okay, so this is going to go through data, which we're going to declare over here. It's going to go through all the data, find just this particular student, and then run. So rather than printing the student, what we want to do is we want to just return the line which contains all the information to do with this one particular person. So to get hold of that, we're just going to make a variable, and then we can call this function. And so now when I run it, I should be able to just type in MH1, which is just this variable here. You could call this anything. I'm just using this variable to assign to, and I'm assigning the information I get given back by getStudent, and getStudent is going to give me back the line which contains all of the information to do with MH1. That's why this is called MH1, but again you can call this whatever you want. So let's run this, and so now just typing in MH1 here gives me all the information, and now I can print it out however I want to. So the next thing to do is, once this function works, is to make it generic. And by generic I mean I want to be able to call this with any ID and get the student information. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give this function an ID, and it's going to store that in a variable called ID, so that this function has ID as an argument. And then instead of saying only find MH1, I'm going to say, well, find any with the ID that I give you. So now when I want to call this, let's make this a little bit more meaningful. So now I can just call this stu for student, or I can call it student here if I want to. And now when I call this function, because I've got ID up here, I need to call it with a parameter, just like we do with the open function over here. And what I'm going to call it with is an ID of student. So let's just find GML2. So let's find GML2, and that should then, I should be able to just type in stu over here and display that information. I mean, in fact, I can just put print stu here and then run this, and there we go. We now have a generic function, which means that this function works for any student ID I want to give it. So I could change this to a different ID. So the way you would build this into your program is probably you would ask the teacher's input and say, which student would you like to find information for, and then store that in a variable and then call this function using that. So all of this, these 3 lines, they are just here to test that both of these functions are doing what they are supposed to be doing.